Welcome, everyone. I appreciate you spending your evening with us, or at least the early part of your evening with us. My name is Christina Hartlieb, and I'm the Executive Director at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House. So welcome to the Harriet Beecher Stowe House and Year of the Woman discussion series. Tonight's topic, just in time for October and Halloween, is Harriet's scary great niece, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who I know a lot of people probably first encountered in a college literature course. That's probably where I first read Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and then I went on to read more stuff after that and was very intrigued by lots. So tonight, I am actually serving not only as your introductory host, but also as a discussion co-leader with Professor John Getz. We want to thank our series sponsor, Ann Lugbill & Associates. We are going to let John get started with tonight's revelries. Like always, he has a timeline of important events connected to tonight's topic. So should I go ahead and put that up now?
Sure, that's good.
All right. Let's go to screen share. And okay.
Coming soon. Here it is.
And as always, this is very discussion-based oriented, and so you can leave your video on as much as you are comfortable and turn on your microphone whenever you're ready to talk, and just turn it off when you're not speaking to cut down on background noise. And once we get through the timeline, we'll put everybody's faces back up so it's easier for discussion purposes.
Yes.
All right, John, you want to take it away?
Sure, thanks, Chris. Well, let's go to the very top of the timeline, some key dates here. 1852 is a date that will be familiar to anybody who's been around any of these discussions or Harriet Beecher Stowe House. That's the year that she published in book form and completed the serialization of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and its impact is well known. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, her great niece, is born 8 years later. So Harriet is already a rock star in the fiction world, and Charlotte Perkins Gilman or Charlotte Perkins, as she was then, is born in Hartford, Connecticut. And I'm going to just read this second part because it's a little complicated. She is the second child of Mary Westcott Perkins and the Beecher side, Frederick Beecher Perkins. That is Harriet Beecher Stowe's nephew. Okay, so Charlotte is the daughter of Harriet's nephew. That's why she's the great niece of Harriet, or grandniece as it's sometimes called. Frederick's mother, Mary Beecher Perkins, is an older sister of Harriet. Got that? Okay. Harriet and Mary are sisters. Mary's son is Frederick Beecher Perkins, and he gets married, and their daughter is Charlotte Perkins. Unfortunately, Frederick was not a very good family man because he abandoned the family while Charlotte was still an infant, but that meant that the young Charlotte and her mother, Mary, would spend a good deal of time in her and her older brother with Mary's sisters, Catherine, Harriet, and Isabella. So
yeah. So can I interject for just a second? So a lot of Charlotte's young childhood was spent kind of shuttling between different relatives because her mother was not able to support the family on her own. Her father had left and did not give them money very frequently. And so, Charlotte's early years were really spent, idolizing and looking up to a lot of her Beecher relatives, but kind of being almost on the outside looking in and amongst that Beecher family. And she was very proud of her Beecher family, but she was a little bit kind of on the outside skirts of it. I did read something when I was reading through parts of her autobiography that she published later in her life. Charlotte talked about she would have been very young, like 4 or 5, when Lincoln was assassinated, but she remembers it. And specifically, she remembers it because Aunt Catherine Beecher, was staying with the family at that point. And so she kind of, connected those events in her young life. But that's just kind of a side note about, how she was very involved with the Beecher family, even though she wasn't a direct part of the larger Beecher clan. All right.
Okay. Next key date would be 1885. Charlotte, by this time, is married. She has become Charlotte Perkins Stetson. And she has the only child she will ever have. That's Catherine Beecher Stetson, keeping that family connection with the Beechers alive. And she is, but she suffers from a severe postpartum depression. And that is going to lead eventually, many years or several years later, to the Yellow Wallpaper. Charlotte, a couple of years later, continued to battle with the depression and sought treatment from Dr. S. Weir Mitchell and underwent his famous rest cure. Now, Mitchell doesn't come off very well from Charlotte's perspective, but he was highly regarded by many of his patients, many of whom were women who were sort of overworked in their family lives. And the rest cure might have done some of them some good, but it was about the worst thing for Charlotte. And she wrote very angrily about that years later, that she was told to live as domestic a life as possible, lie down an hour after each meal, have but 2 hours intellectual life a day, and never touch pen, brush, or pencil as long as you live. Now, he's telling this to somebody who's a writer, who's very artistic. She also spent some time at the Rhode Island School of Design. So she's very talented and very creative. And what he's saying is, you won't get out of your depression unless you basically do nothing and stifle your creativity. Well, eventually she separates from her husband, and that, along with a move to California and increased activism, helped her to get out of her depression, or at least cope with it a lot better. 1891 is a key date. She writes publishes the Giant Wistaria, and then a year later publishes the Yellow Wallpaper. She and Stetson eventually divorce, and by 1898, she's well established as an important women's voice for change, for justice for women, and publishes Women in Economics. Now, Chris, you wanted to say something about that.
Well, that's really, it's not a fiction book. It is a treatise on, women's roles in society and in the economy. And it really highlights the fact that her mother continuously was out of money because she had a hard time supporting herself and her own children, and the father did not contribute as much. And then again, Charlotte herself has to support herself and her daughter. And so it really highlights the difficulties that women had in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to do that. And her own life really focused her writing in terms of, these are the problems that women have because they can't have the same types of careers as men. And it's causing not only emotional stress, but financial stress because of that. All right, thank you.
Okay, probably the next key date to skip ahead to is 1913. Charlotte publishes her feminist utopian novel, Herland, published serially in The Forerunner, which is her own magazine that she's running, a monthly magazine, and she's basically writing and editing the whole thing.
And I think I have the wrong date there. I think you told me to change that, and I forgot to. But yeah, so 1913, and that's probably one of my, here's a copy, Herland. That's probably one of my favorite stories by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. And it's really, in essence, it's kind of the prototype of the Wonder Woman origin story. So if you have not read it, it is a fascinating read in terms of, you know, a women's only society and how they are able to have a society without men.
So yeah, well worth your time. And this was an era where many utopian novels were being written from different perspectives. This is one of the most readable and has the most, I think, dramatic conflict going on within it of any of those that were done at that time. So some of them can get pretty talky, but this one holds interest, I think, all the way through. And then she wrote a sequel too, a couple of years later, called With Her in Our Land. So I think that's probably a good enough introduction to put her into perspective, into the time frame in which she lived. So, Chris?
Okay, so in terms of, I'm going to put up for just a second because I want to make sure that people can see each other, but I will put up for just a moment. These are the discussion questions that we'll kind of be talking about throughout the course of the evening. So starting with the yellow wallpaper and making some you know, strong thought ideas about her state of mind and the actual wallpaper itself. And then we'll move into kind of a comparison between the two stories and hopefully end on the Giant Wistaria. But, you know, it's a fluid conversation, so if it doesn't go exactly according to this plan, that's okay. But that's kind of our trajectory as we get started. So the first big question that we're going to open it up to everyone to talk about is, how would you describe the narrator's state of mind at the beginning of the yellow wallpaper? And how does that compare to her state at the end? So beginning of the yellow wallpaper and the end of yellow wallpaper, how is the narrator feeling and coping? Anyone want to jump in to start with? Yes, go ahead.
Diane?
Yeah.
Hi. When I first started, before I read her background and ended with the story, I realized she was going through the same thing that Charlotte did, postpartum depression. The beginning, she wasn't crazy about it, but, you know, she went along with it. And the only thing really being confined was her fixation on the wallpaper. She was creative, and I'm sure that that was something that probably a lot of people might not have even paid attention to. But as time went on, she got more and more obsessed. And at the end, I assume they left, and, you know, it seemed like I guess at that time they didn't understand it because her husband seemed to be really domineering, didn't understand her at all.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And she was that was almost what she went through herself.
Right, so there's definitely some congruency between the narrator of the story and Charlotte herself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So at the beginning, she doesn't really seem that crazy. She just seems upset, depressed, like not sure what's going on in terms of, you know, why am I not feeling well and why am I locked in this room? So why do you think, what would make the husband, who was supposedly a medical doctor himself, what would make him lock her in the room, do you think?
Well, if I could?
Yes, go ahead.
I think he obviously thinks she's really disturbed. And he doesn't pay much attention to her. I think you're right that she starts out knowing that she has a problem, but thinking that she can get out of it. She looks out the window and I think she believes she can get out of that room, but he's not going to let her out of that room. And this gets deeper and deeper, and I think she's always aware that it's getting deeper and deeper. I also, although the color yellow can be quite bright and cheerful, it also can be quite dreadful, like the color of urine even, and dirty. And I felt as it went on that the color of the yellow was like dirty, and it was covering something else up. That's what wallpaper does. So it was a covering up, and it was being covered up with dirt. The longer I read it, the more I felt that that color yellow was not bright and cheerful, but a dirty, dreadful color. And I think she came aware that she was going to be caught in that dreadfulness.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Anyone else have some ideas or insights comparing the narrator at the beginning versus at the end? Diane, you want to say something else?
I was just a little confused because they talked about her going outside, unless I read it wrong. So she did get out of the room, right? She talked about walks, taking walks and getting fresh air.
But doesn't he really opposed that? I think she got out now and then, but I think he really opposed that.
And it would have
Well, I don't think he really, well, like, he did, they didn't understand postpartum depression back then.
John, you want to add?
Well, I think when she did get out, and she does mention a couple of times, it's very supervised. So she's still very much under her husband's control at that point.
Jump in. I think at the beginning she seems more passive, and at the end she's more active in a crazy way. But her passivity, what is one to do, right? Like she's just kind of like, oh, what am I going to do about it, and trying to be reasonable and go with the flow and everything. But by the end, she realizes that that's actually the crazy thing to do, right? Like to just accept being locked there or being stuck there. And then she sort of shifts into action mode, but that's, being insane and going around the room, rubbing her shoulder on the wall and peeling the wallpaper off. So it's kind of an interesting switch because you think, it's at the beginning she seems more sane and at the end more insane, but you could sort of see it the opposite way too, right? The more that she's quiet and passive, that's more of the strange thing to be, I think, to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Especially given the way women were treated. And given the limited understanding of men or women's psychology, but particularly women's at that time.
Mm-hmm.
I found that at the beginning, for me, through the entire thing, I found that she has a whole lot of credibility. The fact that it's written in first person, she's almost confiding in the reader. Oh, this is the way I think, and this is what I feel, and of course, this is what my husband is doing, and he's such a good man, and I hang on his every word, and yes, whatever John wants, not you, John Getz. I will do whatever John wants, and by the end, the true colors, I'm sorry for the pun with Yellow Wallpaper, but the true colors of that relationship also come out. And again, I think that I find her still highly credible at the end. Yes, as she has gone mad, she's been driven crazy, so to speak. But it's still very, very real and not out of the realm of reality. The thing that also struck me throughout, or at some point, she actually makes a mention of Weir Mitchell, of the doctor, and in her own way, she's hanging some blame on him for the way that her husband is treating her because of Mitchell being, the leader in this kind of thing. So she gets in her digs, which, if I'm correct, later he does the Dr. Mitchell does retract the kind of treatment that he had previously prescribed for people or for women in this kind of a situation. And and went off in another direction. Is that right, John?
That's an interesting point. She claimed that. She, as I mentioned on the handout, she did send a copy to Mitchell, a copy of the story. And she claims in her autobiography that this caused him to reverse field and stop treating people in this fashion. However, there's no other evidence for that, that she really had any effect on him at all. He never answered her letter, including the story. And in fact, from what we know, he continued the treatment. So that was her claim, but there's no external validation for that.
Mm. Amy, you wanted to jump in there?
Well, I just wanted to say one of the things I thought was interesting was the pacing. So at the beginning of the story, there seemed to be a sort of slower narration, almost a lyrical sort of phrasing in her sentence structure. But then toward the end, the pacing increased rapidly. And it seemed to mirror her mental state in the way she wrote her narration, which I found fascinating.
Kara's microphone's not working, but she did write in the chat. She sees similarities to the reasons people were arguing against women's suffrage in the early 1900s, and I guess the late 1800s as well, that women would become less feminine and want to become involved in life outside the home. And it's like this transition of realizing the crazy life of allowing women to be themselves would be so dangerous for others, especially for the men. So, but yeah, there's, you could see it as an allegory for, women overall in terms of, women have no, going back to that, women in economics, and also to the idea of women in voting, but women have no power outside the home. They are confined to the home. And the narrator here is not only confined to the home, but she's confined to this one room in the home. And it's, slowly encompassing her overall and her mental state as well, because she just sees the same thing over and over and over.
And in a way, she represents what was happening to the wives of a lot of professional men or men who were making any amount of money at that time. The idea was your wife wasn't supposed to work. She, if a woman was working, they saw it as a badge of not having much money. So if the less the woman does, the wealthier her husband appears to be. Thorstein Veblen wrote about that in The Theory of the Leisure Class, which came out right around this time too. And so the woman becomes an ornament to her husband by how little she does. The less she does, the better from that perspective. So there was a kind of, and this is part of what's happening with the urbanization of the US at this time too. A woman on the farm had to work. She was clearly a part of the economic life of the farm, but in the city, once a guy made enough money to supposedly support his wife, the more money she spent and the less productive she was, the better he looked. So that's Veblen's take on it. And I think she's probably, with her knowledge of economics and her interest in politics, I think Gilman's probably drawing on that development in history too.
Okay.
I think the ending leaves you wondering, what's going to happen when she goes back to her existence before this time. And obviously Charlotte came through, but does this woman come through? And that's one thing she didn't address, and that's probably, she's leaving you come up with your own decisions on how she ended or how she continued with her life after that. It was sort of, in a way, is this it? At the end, when it's like, what happens now? And we never did find out. So,
I
That's
think
a good speculation for us. What do you think happens to her after the end of the story? Anyone want to venture a guess?
I don't think she'd get any better if she's suppressed. Anytime anyone's suppressed and they can't be themselves and pursue what they want, I don't know how she would have gotten any better.
Mm-hmm.
I actually assumed she was institutionalized after that.
Mm.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was that bad. I thought that would be what her husband would do. She would institutionalize.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, possibly. Yeah.
I would think that too. And this links up with another development that a number of critics have talked about. Most Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar, two of the earliest feminist critics back in the 1970s and 80s, wrote a book called The Mad Woman in the Attic. And their title comes from Jane Eyre, from that novel of Bertha Mason in the Attic. But they see this as a kind of pattern that runs through a lot of women's writing and even some men's writing in the 19th century, because if a woman would be assertive at all, would try to express herself, it was easy to say she's crazy rather than to listen to what she was saying. And for what the shape that this woman is in by the end, I would think that she's going to wind up in an institution or almost locked in an attic.
That's what I thought too.
Yeah.
That's right. But you know, I'm not knowing anyone who's gone through postpartum depression. With the rest, and maybe if she had been downstairs, which she wanted to be in the first place, and not locked in a room, I would assume that after a while, your body takes hold in you, become physically more strong. You're stronger, and therefore your mind would. I don't know, but I just don't understand why her husband insisted she be upstairs in a locked room, which makes you wonder if he thought she was worse than she was. But
Kara also wrote in the chat about reminding of Nellie Bly, who was an actual journalist who went into asylums to document and expose the conditions within those women's asylums, and portraying the horrible medical condition or horrible medical treatments of those. And so that kind of comparison to real life activities as well. And then she also asked, or was he worried that she would hurt the baby? And that's another one of my questions. In at least in this story, but also in the other one a little bit. But who was taking care of the baby? They talk about like some servant women here and there. I think they named like 2 or 3 in this story, a Mary and somebody else that was maybe the housekeeper or taking care of the baby at times, but we don't really get a good feeling. I didn't really get a good feeling as to who exactly was taking care of the baby and why wasn't she allowed to see the baby at all? And
she never asked to see the baby.
Well, that's true. Did she?
Which,
okay.
all she thought about the creative side, wanted to be with the people that were fun and light, but she never talked about her baby.
True.
So what kind of mother would she have been anyway? I don't know.
So that's an interesting biographical point again about Charlotte herself, who once she divorced, she and Stetson divorced, she basically sent, or at least offered the chance to her daughter to go live with her father. She encouraged that because she said, I want my daughter to have a good relationship with her father. And then when he remarried somebody who was one of Charlotte's friends, she kind of blessed the marriage and said, well, she might even be a better mother than I was. So she was fine with that. And boy, did she take a lot of heat for that. This was contrary to the domestic ideal of that time, obviously. And Kate Chopin talks about that a little bit in her book, The Awakening, too, which was written in the 1890s, about the mother women in the culture that she writes about, these women who just, that's their lives and they love it and they don't want anything else. The main character there, Edna, does want something else. So this is a big issue for women at this time and, on into later years for sure.
The thing that surprised me was when, they insisted their way was the correct way, and she gave them hints about how she could help herself get better,
Yes,
and they just ignored them.
yes.
Which-
Listening to the patient was not one of their strong suits
Yeah,
at all.
exactly.
John,
Why
what's,
not? Because she was a woman.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
I have a question about her contemporaries. Was Isabella about the same age as the author, as Charlotte, or how did they, since they spent a lot of time when she was young, she spent a lot of time in their family, was she more of Isabella's age, and could there have been influence, the feminist influence from Isabella in her writing?
Well, she would have been, as a child and growing up teenager, that's really when Isabella Beecher Hooker, the youngest of the Beecher sisters, was getting into the women's suffrage movement.
I thought.
So she would have seen her aunt Isabella really getting into that movement and becoming a women's suffrage advocate in Connecticut, so in the Northeast, where Charlotte was growing up. So she would have seen that taking place.
Well, the polarities between Catherine and Isabel, I think, were considerable.
Mm-hmm.
And if I look at Charlotte, I say, oh, she would hang out with, definitely not with Catherine, and she would probably be pretty critical of Catherine as being, at best, old school, and at worst, one who also is helping to keep women down. And that is an interesting dynamic, and also an interesting tension within that family. That it's compelling to see that progression over time as they become more involved in women's issues and feminist issues, and Charlotte is part of the flowering of that, I think, in the Beecher family.
Right, I would say so. So think about, because I kind of a follow-up question to, the narrator cares a lot about the wallpaper, and we've talked a little bit about the symbolism of the wallpaper. Is it bright and sunny, or is it dark and dirty? Kind of what color of yellow is that? But it's almost as if the wallpaper itself is a whole nother character.
Mm-hmm.
So what does the character of the wallpaper do for the story? Or what does the character of the wallpaper bring to the narrator's dimension?
I agree 100%. As I was starting to read it, I looked at John, who happened to be sitting nearby, and I said, oh, so now we've got wallpaper as a character in a story, huh? And in part, I think it's interesting because it seems alive to her, and then therefore to us as well, a living, breathing, changing, somewhat chameleon-like, and she interacts with it as she would another individual or another character in any kind of literary work. It changes, it starts out being not so bad and not so threatening and not so weird, just kind of ugly, and goes from that into a totally different kind of morphism that I think was fascinating. I just really, I enjoyed her writing. I think she's an excellent writer, but I enjoyed that characterization of an inanimate object as well.
And how it progresses, it becomes
Absolutely.
more animate throughout the course of the story.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But as I said earlier, it's covering up something, and
So what is it covering?
she is not willing to expose totally what it's covering up. She peels pieces of it off, but then doesn't really expose what's behind it. And I don't think that there's a physical thing behind it. I think that there is but it symbolizes a hiding of something and an unwillingness to totally expose that something, to me.
Anyone else see
Yeah,
the symbolism behind? Go ahead, Barbara.
I think there's just an interesting progression that in the beginning of it, the woman who's in the wallpaper is separate from her. It's something else she's seeing that's apart from her, but as it progresses, it becomes her. She becomes that woman who's escaped from
That's what I thought too. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And also just the idea that wallpaper itself seems like it would be something that the women would pick out, right? To decorate the house, and her husband won't even let her decide about that, right? He's, oh, we're not going to fix that now, or, we're not going to change it or whatever, or even move her to a different room. So even the domestic decisions are out of her control too.
And then look at Kara's comment. Could her postpartum depression be covering up her wish to be free of child and domestic life?
Yeah,
That's
that's a good idea.
That's what I thought.
Diane?
No,
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
that's what I thought. I agree.
Okay. All right.
I can't imagine. It just, her husband seems like, well, I'm not sure he would be a stereotype maybe of the men then. I mean, there had to be men, listen, there had to be men who really would listen to what she had to say. He didn't have any time to listen to what she had to say. And I can't believe that every single or most of the men then would have done that. I just think he was disconnected from the whole scenario.
I disagree. I really do. I mean, men at the time didn't listen. I mean, they had what she's trying to say is men have the power. And this is her way of exhibiting that. I agree with you. I think it's a little extreme, but it's probably not that far off from what a lot of women experienced. I mean, when you look at other literature of the time, when you know, if you watch, recently there's been a series on PBS about women's suffrage and the way their husbands treated them and the way men treated them. And it's like, well, okay, this makes sense. It's torture, it's abuse, it's a terribly abusive relationship, but it was not uncommon. And I think that that's been reflected in other literature of the time.
And his authority comes also from the fact that he's a doctor. And so he thinks he knows best because of that. And his brother's a doctor, and says the same thing. So it's obviously a very male-dominated profession in those days, and doctor knew best. So the idea of questioning what doctor/husband wants you to do is very, very hard for her to do. She's very conflicted about that throughout the story.
All right. Well, let's look at the similarities between the Yellow Wallpaper and the Giant Wistaria. I have to admit that while I was familiar with the first story, I was not familiar with the second story until John had us read it. So the Giant Wistaria, how does that compare to the Yellow Wallpaper? What are some things that they have in common? Anyone want to start?
Yeah, well,
Go ahead, Barbara.
A few things I noticed. There's the whole baby situation, and both of them, where having a baby becomes a difficult situation in different ways in the stories. And then also something that's seemingly organic looking, like the wallpaper, sort of, creepy crawly, and the wistaria, the same thing, the way it's naughty and, that sort of thing. Both of those two things, concealing something or holding things back, those are very similar, the two.
Okay. Good. Other things?
The powerlessness of the woman comes through loudly and clearly, and so much so that in the first one, the woman who has the child has maybe a line or two, and after that, she's voiceless. She doesn't even have a voice. She's not just powerless, but she's voiceless. And then curiously, then when you flip into the era where people have come and they're spending time there and they experience the quote haunted house, that you would want to believe that, oh, things have changed, but the men still have the upper hand. They're still telling them what's going on, and they're even lying to the women. They're manipulating for their own ends, and not being sensitive to what the women's wishes are. So, you know, same old, same old.
Okay. Did you notice that both women were locked in the attic? In the Yellow Wallpaper, she's literally in the attic room, and there's a gate at the door, or the gate at the top of the stairs, and bars on the windows. And then in the Giant Wistaria, the young woman, you know, she comes downstairs for a while, and then the servant woman's supposed to put her back, and then the servant girl brings the mom the key. So that tells me that she got locked back upstairs, and the servant girl is bringing the mother / grandmother, I guess, the key to her room because she's been locked in for the night. So.
And there's an attempt to silence both of the women too. The woman in the Yellow Wallpaper she is a writer, and yet she's not allowed to write. She's just sneaking access to the paper that she writes for us. And this woman, when her father shows up, he puts his hand over her mouth to get her to shut up. So there's that silencing in both stories too.
There's also the use of color and smell in both of them is kind of similar, because the yellow color, the worse it gets over time with her, and the worse connotation it has for her. Same thing with the deep dark color of the leaves in the wisteria, and then also the smells, how she mentions the smell of the wallpaper permeating things. And then the same thing, same kind of concept with the wisteria, the smells in the old house and stuff too.
Okay. Other things? So, go ahead, Amy.
I was just going to say, in both stories, the woman becomes a part of the house, literally.
Ooh, okay. So becoming like organically or symbolically or both meshed in with the house somehow. Okay. So what do you think happened to the young woman and the baby? What transpired between the two stories, or between the two parts of the story? What happened after the end of the first part, clearly well before the beginning of the second part?
Well, I got the impression, I don't know, her father wanted her to marry someone she insisted she wasn't going to marry. So I guess I was sort of left wondering, did she just sort of live there without and not being able to contact her baby? I assume her parents went back to London. And so pardon?
Yes, I was going to say, yeah, probably. But I guess the big question for me is, did she get killed somehow, or did she just die of starvation because she was locked in the attic and no one would let her out? Amy, you want to add to that?
Well, I thought that in the story it refers to both her body and then the baby's body, because they asked how old the baby's body was, and it was a couple of months. So I took it that they were both somehow enmeshed in the house, and I was trying to figure out who killed them. I spent a day trying to figure out. I still don't know who killed them. Like, was it one of her parents? Did she harm herself? Was it the new husband? Because he didn't seem, I mean, he doesn't appear, but the conversation about him did not make him favorable, in my opinion. So who kind of did that to her? Question.
I'm going to look to John for this.
I don't think the story tells us for sure.
No, not really.
I think we could, several scenarios have been proposed here, and we might even be able to think of another one or two. Did she kill herself because she didn't want to go back to England? Did she kill the baby? Did drown the baby? Did the father do that to the baby? Did he kill her because she wouldn't go back to England with them? I don't think the story tells us for sure. And there are two responses you could make to that. One is it doesn't matter because she's oppressed no matter what happened. And number two, why might the author, and I want to know what you think about this, why might the author deliberately leave it that ambiguous? I mean, some readers think, well, she just wasn't clear enough, and that's a problem in the story. And I suppose you could say that, but I'm going to give her the benefit of the doubt and say that the author did know what she was doing here, and that there might be one or more good reasons for leaving this the exact fate of the young mother and the baby unclear.
Can I add something? Maybe it's to point out that no matter what her choices were, she was kind of out of luck, right? Like no matter which of those scenarios happened, there was nothing left for her, really. I mean, if you think about the one gentleman in the story who had the dream where the girl was walking across to, wasn't it a bureau or something, and taking something out of it, that made me think that if that's a piece of the real story, that she was trying to escape. Like maybe she did marry this cousin and she was trying to sneak out of the house with the baby in the bundle and the stuff, and maybe he murdered her, and that's how she ended up in the cellar with the baby in the well, and all that. But maybe maybe it's that there was no way out, so that's why she leaves it ambiguous, because they all kind of led to her demise, any of those choices.
It could be the mad woman in the attic or the dead woman in the cellar, apparently.
It seems to me that no matter what way you look at it, that somehow men are responsible for her demise.
Yeah.
When the father says, she's marrying her cousin, by God, he said she had refused the man before, but now she had this baby and we have to restore the honor of our family, and so he's marrying her. Well, perhaps it was a deal. The idea was, all right, he's taking her away, but he's taking her away because he's getting her out of the family, because it's such a disgrace that she had this child out of wedlock. And maybe it's a conspiracy of men. That's certainly one interpretation. But no matter how I think it through, there's always a purposefulness on the part of men to put her into the situation that she finds herself in that is way less than desirable, and again presents men as having the power and the authority and the moral the rules of morality by which everyone has to live and either survive or die. So that male domination is still very much there.
I'm trying to remember, was there did she actually marry her cousin? It's sort of ambiguous.
He's supposed to
be left in the house. Locked in the house. I don't remember anything about her marrying her cousin.
That's the father's plan for her, and I think that would be back in England. She goes back to England and marries her cousin, whom she detests. But
Amy, go ahead.
Well, I don't disagree with what Joanne was saying about the culpability of the men in this story, but what still kind of strikes me, and I don't know where this leads, is it's her mother's vines that she gets trapped up in, like literally at the beginning of the story. And then it's her mother, she begs to see the baby, and her mother's sort of complicit as well. So, I mean, she's not not culpable.
Right.
And I don't know how that fits into it's depressive, clearly, but I don't know how that fits into the schematic of the rest of the story. I didn't know if anyone else had thoughts on it.
I think the mother does have some sympathy with her daughter, but she doesn't feel she has any power to help her. And so, she's probably right, but to the extent that she doesn't try harder, I would say you could put some guilt on her too, some responsibility. But so she affirms the patriarchy by not reacting against it.
Kara's added something over in the chat about, it's interesting that the character in this story wants to so badly to hold her baby and isn't allowed to, because Charlotte seemed to be happy to send her daughter to live with the dad and stepmom, and the story seems to contrast with her reality and with the Yellow Wallpaper. So this particular young woman wants to be an involved mother, and that almost leads me to think that, you know, maybe the dad threw the baby down the well to get rid of the evidence and get rid of the baby, and then she had nothing else to live for, so she killed herself in some way, either through starvation or harming herself. But once the baby was gone, she didn't really want to continue. Yes, I know it's sad, I'm sorry.
You're talking about the biological father, correct?
We don't know who the father of the baby, we don't know who the father's baby is. We know her father, the young woman's father, is the one that's so mad about the whole situation. And John has a theory about that, but I don't know if you want to get into that.
Well, they were both coming from England back to North America together on the ship. Just the father and the daughter and the wisteria vine, and suddenly the girl shows up pregnant when they get home. I wonder if one of the reasons that the father isn't so zealous about keeping this quiet is that he might be the father.
Oh.
Yeah, I think that doesn't it say something about the way he says it is something about if I had known I was bringing you this, what's the word he uses?
Shame.
Shame. Yeah, that made me think, what's going on here?
Oh,
You know?
good. Yeah, that's good. That's good.
And again, if you want to talk about abusive males, that would be like the ultimate thing, and the ultimate reason for him to want to keep it quiet.
Exactly.
I think the very indefiniteness of all of this that we're talking about, to me, the value of that is it reminds us of how many stories have been suppressed in the past, how many stories of abuse, of all the sorts of things we're talking about as possibilities in this story. I think if she spelled it all out for us, it would apply to one story. But in this case, there are multiple stories that are possible. And we don't know ultimately how many of those stories were lost, in how many ways the women who had stories to tell that were really important were silenced one way or another.
So what's the purpose of the second half of this story, where you have the three young couples and they find this cool old house, they want to, you know, have a party in this cool old house and rent it out for the summer, and then they tell each other ghost stories? And what's the point of that whole dynamic? I'm listening, because I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Except to bring young people into it again. Young people who seem to not have children yet.
Mm-hmm.
And so what is their purpose in the overall scheme of the telling?
Well, maybe it's just a vehicle to allow the discovery of the baby and the body.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's just a vehicle for the discovery of what's happened.
Mm-hmm.
It's an awfully complicated vehicle, I'll admit.
It's complicated, but do the women have more power or voice amongst these couples than they did 100 years ago? Let me rephrase that. Did the women of the three young women, particularly the one that found the house originally, and then her two friends or sisters, or however it played out, but so you have the young women in the second half of the story, how much more power do they have in their own lives?
Well, they were able to help actually decide which house to go to, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, opposite of the Yellow Wallpaper, and of course opposite of way back when there was everything was B and that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So they did have a little bit more agency, at least in this case, they had more agency in terms of, oh, you want to rent this out for the summer? Okay, this is where we're going to hang out. Sure.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Other things. What do the ghost stories tell us?
Well, they were looking for the ghost stories too, right? I mean, there was an active pursuit of, what's going on, and going down and going to the cellar, finding a ghost story. They were looking for the ghost story. I think at one point they said for 3 days, or going around to the woman who was doing the wash at the beginning, and they were doing their best to try to find something.
Mm-hmm. Like they were actively searching for a haunted house to hang out.
Yeah, rather than being trapped up in the attic and finding the haunting inside the wallpaper.
Okay. Amy, go ahead.
Sorry, this is about the point before. There's a sentence in there that says young husbands are indulgent. And so it just seemed like an interesting contrast between a woman who's being forced into a marriage with someone she hates versus people who chose their husband.
Okay, now we're getting somewhere. So women have more power when they, yeah, okay. Young husbands are more indulgent. I like that. Anything else? When they found the baby, and I don't remember which one was which, but the women said one thing and the men said the other thing. When they said, how long do you think, how long, one of them said, 100 years ago, and the other one said a month old. So I think it was the women that were interested in the fact that the baby was only a month old, and the men were interested in the fact that it had been down there for 100 years. Am I getting that right, or did I make those backwards?
I think that's right.
Mm-hmm.
So is that significant that they think of the time frame in a different way? When you say how long or how many, am I asking the question in a difficult way? Because I don't have the text.
No, it's a hard question to answer. I think that's why people aren't saying anything.
Okay.
Maybe the age of the baby is something that's, I don't know, just maybe more personal to the women for some reason. I don't know why, but that just strikes me as something that would hit them harder emotionally, but maybe that's not being fair.
No, that was my initial reaction too, that, the women would be more in tune with how old was this baby, or, how the poor child, only a month old or whatever. Yeah.
And Jenny's husband, George, is a doctor, like John in the other story. And so he answers the clinical, well, it's probably been in there for 100 years. And the lime preserves the bones or whatever. And so yeah, the perspectives are still different. I think it's to me, it's a freer and easier time. They can joke with each other. And at least George takes seriously enough Jenny's uneasiness about it that he does go down to the cellar and check it out. But of course, he puts her to sleep first with that bromide that he gives her, a sedative. She's upset. So it's kind of, I think it's ambivalent at the end to me, that there's some things are better, but
interestingly enough, the two stories were written a year apart. So the time frame is the same in terms of the author giving us these two stories, but that idea of more of a companionate marriage or more agency for women is really transitioning here in the last decade of the 19th century. And
yeah.
so And Kara says the time with the couple seems much more modern, almost like it was written after Charlotte had died, but could be her idea of what the future could be.
Well,
So
and
maybe in the future, women would have more agency and power within their marriages.
she was happy in her second marriage. That was much more of a equal give and take, I think, than her first marriage.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, surprisingly, it is already 8 o'clock. So does anyone have last questions or last comments? I'll let John make any extra questions or comments before we wrap things up.
I just have a
Okay.
quick question.
Yes.
Was Harriet an influence on Charlotte literary wise? Like, did she encourage her to write?
Ooh, that is a good question.
Yeah.
I think kind of indirectly. I would say that and I have not read all of Harriet's novels because there are many. But I would say the one novel that this made me think of the most was one called Pink and White Tyranny. And Pink and White Tyranny is basically the idea that women have no economic agency in the late 1800s. And it's almost, now that I think about it, structurally, it's almost more of it's similar to Ruth Bader Ginsburg in terms of it's structured so that there's this wife, pretty young wife, the guy gets married, and because she's such a pretty young wife, and he thinks he's going to be in love forever with her, but she is a terrible person. She's just horrible. She doesn't do anything, and she makes all these demands, and she's just literally the worst person imaginable. She's not a good housekeeper, etc. And the moral of the story, which I was upset about the first time I read it, the moral of the story basically was, well, you can't divorce her because then what's she going to do? You are financially responsible for this woman for the rest of your life. So that's the moral of Pink and White Tyranny. But then when I put it into a 20th century perspective, it's almost like Harriet was saying, perhaps, and I might be stretching a little bit, but it's almost like Harriet was saying that, in order for us to make any changes and demonstrate problems with gender inequality, we have to make it so that men see the gender inequality, so that then they'll make changes to making gender more equitable. I see John nodding, so I'm hoping that I'm on the right track there.
I'm finally getting the Ruth Bader
into the room. Who's actually cooking dinner at the moment, so go for it. Good for me. But all right, sorry. I don't know if that's. But so my point is that Harriet didn't talk about these kind of issues overall, but that's the book that most kind of talks about terms of gender equality and inequality and why you would, those types of things. Other than that, I'm not sure that Charlotte was influenced by Harriet's topic matter, but just the idea of having a published writer in the family and being proud of being a member of that family definitely would have played some factor in her, yes, I can do this too. So, all right. John, any last words?
Well, just maybe to try to pull the two stories together again, each has a central symbol. I'll be the English prof here. We have the yellow wallpaper in the first story, and Gilbert and Gubar, those feminist critics, talk about when at the end of the story, when the narrator starts ripping the wallpaper off the wall, they compare two kinds of paper, the paper she's writing on and the paper on the wall. And as she strips the wallpaper off, they see her stripping away the patriarchal texts all those bodies of all the work by those dead white males that you hear about dominating the literary canon. And while we talked about that in the late 20th century, that sort of thing was really happening at the time that that Gilman's writing these stories, because there was a movement against the popularity of women writers like Harriet that was starting in magazines like The Nation, and Henry James was one of the reviewers who was responsible for that, saying that these women were sentimental and they weren't good writers and all of that. So you've got kind of a male reaction against and an affirmation of the patriarchal text of the male writers against women. Well, she needs to strip those patriarchal texts off the wall so she can write her own text. And then go ahead.
Interesting. No, I agree. Mm-hmm.
And then the Giant Wistaria, which is the central symbol in the next story, is a really interesting one. I happen to like wisteria vines. I think they're gorgeous, but I'm not so sure this one in this story is a positive thing. Comes from England, not native to England. It's basically, there is a native American wisteria, but it's much smaller. I think this is the great big ones that you see in some buildings around Cincinnati. And beautiful flowers, but they're almost tree-like. They're very strong. And here it has kind of taken over the whole house and winds up symbolically strangling the girl who's down in the basement. She's strangled by the vine. I think it might be, once again, the male power structure. Alluring, attractive in many ways, but dangerous. And the giant wisteria seeds are actually poisonous. So it's an interesting horticultural symbol, I think, in this in here. That and remember, it's Jenny who loves the wisteria. She says, "Don't hurt that wisteria when you're redoing the porch here." So maybe the patriarchy lingers. Things are better in many ways, but problems not solved.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all for the great discussion, great insights. It was fun hanging out with all of you. Thanks also to our sponsor for the series, which is Ann Ludville and Associates. We look forward to next month's discussion, November 4th, holiday entertaining tips from the Beecher sisters, with Dr. Getz, of course, and also Dr. Kristen Renzi from Xavier. We are also working on our 2021 spring series. Actually, John's doing most of the work. I'm not really, which will be framed as After Uncle Tom's Cabin, Black Voices for Justice. So stay tuned for more information. And again, thank you all for coming tonight, and have a good evening. If you have plans in a little while, have fun with them.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you all.
Thank
very
you.
much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Have a good
Thank you so
night.
much. Great to see you all.